I was looking at the top kind of 10-ish, 12-ish of the draft, and I think you can make an argument for several teams in that range that need an offensive line. The Bears absolutely need another tackle. The Titans need everything, but their offensive line is one of the starting points there. You can make an argument that the Eagles could draft a tackle with the 10th pick in the draft if they want to draft an heir apparent to Lane Johnson with that pick, even if it might not help them right away. So I wanted to kick it off by asking, if you had a pick in that range, let's say you had the 11th overall pick in the draft, and you need a starting left tackle, and every offensive lineman in this draft is on the board, who would you take?
For me, this would come down to Paris Johnson from Ohio State, the more prototypical left tackle, was a guard in 2021, moved to left tackle, his more natural left tackle this past year for the Buckeyes, and played outstanding. But I'm going to go with Peter Skoronski from Northwestern, and he's in my guard rankings because I'm basically treating him like Zach Martin. Can he play tackle in the NFL? Yeah, I believe he can. But do I think his game could be maximized at guard? Yeah, I do. So as long as my coaching staff is on board, I would be fine going with Skoronski to play left tackle. And I was talking with Cowboys VP of player personnel, Will McClay, at the Combine about some outliers and things like this. And he had an interesting analogy about, he mentioned how like a blind person, like theoretically has amplified hearing because obviously they rely on their other senses to kind of, make that up. And it's kind of similar with physical outliers in football. And, with Peter Skoronski, who does not have very long arms, 32.25 inch, which that's, Brandon, we don't have a current starter at tackle in the NFL shorter than 32.25, right?
No, not that I'm aware of. No.
Yeah, right.
So just on that same page, I looked it up. Since 2000, there have been 17 offensive linemen in the NFL who have made a Pro Bowl with arm length less than 32.5. 11 of those 12 players are centers. 12 if you count Cody Whitehair. Other guys on the list: Marshall Yanda, Richie Incognito, Evan Mathis, Chris Snee. John Stitchcomb is the only offensive tackle to hit that mark. If you expand it to 33, you only get Rashawn Slater and Donald Penn. That's it.
Right, and that's exactly it. So, back to that analogy, like if it really helps you become substantially better in other areas. So, like a guy like Peter Skoronski, we see that with him because he's never been super long, but he wins with his feet, with his processing. With his technique, he's never had to rely on that length. So it's helped him develop in those other areas and get the most out of them. And I think it's one of the main takeaways with Skoronski is, you take all the top athletes in whatever sport you want, Mike Trout, Steph Curry, Tiger Woods, whatever, physically, what do they have in common? It's repeatable technique. It's just very repeatable with what they do in their process. And I think for Skoronski, that might be his superpower. That might be what separates him. He has the movement skills. The IQ is there. That's definitely part of this. But the repeatable technique is, I think, what really kind of separates him and separates the good from the great.
Before we dig deeper into Skoronski, Brandon, who is your answer to this question?
Yeah, so I took this question as, this guy has to play left tackle for me. And, we're not going to be able to move him kind of thing. Like I kind of boxed myself in with it. And
that's a fair way to take it. That's how I wanted you to take it for this exact reason as we discuss Skoronski.
Okay. So, with that said, I would go with Paris Johnson from Ohio State. And, that's because I think, he is more prototypical in terms of size. And that's really the biggest differentiator. To me, I have, similar to Dane, I have Peter Skoronski projected as an interior offensive lineman who can play tackle. So, if I wanted to take the best overall offensive lineman, I would take Peter Skoronski. But if I'm, boxed in at left tackle, I'd probably go with Paris Johnson, because their grades aren't too different overall to me. Skoronski's a little bit higher, but yeah, Paris is my number one tackle, in the draft, and not by much. There's kind of a cluster there as well, but that'd probably be the guy that I would go with in this scenario.
So what are the limitations with a guy who has 32.25 inch arms, Brandon? When you're thinking about why he can be an extremely successful college offensive tackle and why he might struggle at tackle a little bit in the NFL with that size and frame, what are the actual tangible reasons for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could see it, pop up on Skoronski's film as well, and other guys. I think the biggest thing is, certain body types, and especially in the NFL, there's a lot of them. They're going to be able to establish first meaningful contact, and once they do that, they kind of gain quick control of the rep, and they force the tackle into recovery mode. And Skoronski's very good at recovering, but doing that, at an increased rate in the NFL compared to what he did in college, I just think is kind of a recipe to not get the most out of him, whereas inside, he's dealing with a little bit, there is some big, long guys inside, but there's not as much space that you have to negotiate there as, either. And there are also, shorter, kind of more, condensed body types inside as well. And I just think his skill set translates very well. It's very similar to, Ali Marpet, Brandon Scherf, Joe Bitonio, Joe Tooney, Zach Martin. The list goes on. Elijah Vera Tucker, all these guys, most of those guys could probably play tackle, and they have in spurts. Joe Tooney just did it. Bitonio just did it. Zach Martin's done it. But, would you rather have a middle of the pack left tackle or an all-pro guard? And that's an interesting question, but I would rather have the blue chip guy regardless of the position. So that's, kind of went on a tangent a little bit there, but strictly in terms of that arm length thing, I think the first meaningful contact is a big thing. And another kind of differentiating factor here that plays into this answer is, looking at Skoronski and Slater. Slater does have a little bit longer arms, but the main differentiator between those two to me is Slater is more powerful and stout than Skoronski. Skoronski is, I think, at least average, maybe above average in play strength and power. But Slater is special in that regard. And I don't see Skoronski having that same anchoring strength and power that Rashawn Slater has. And therefore, I think that could be mitigated a little bit easier inside, actually.
Slater's also a better athlete overall. If you look at the testing, like top to bottom, his testing numbers are just better than Skoronski's. So if we're finding reasons why Slater could be an exceptional left tackle and Skoronski might not, that might be another point in Slater's favor. Dan, you talk about that repeatable movement. What do you mean when you say that? His ability to kind of repeat those movements consistently. How does that manifest, and how does that potentially overcome some of these length concerns?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest thing, because when offensive linemen at the NFL level, they're all big, they all move well, they're all strong. The guys that really separate themselves are the guys that are very technically sound, very proficient with the way they attack. It's timing, it's combination of the timing, placement, all of that, and it is mental as it is, as much mental as it is physical. And so with a guy like with Skoronski, his ability, and Brandon kind of touched on this, his ability to recover from being put in different compromised positions is just really, really impressive. So it doesn't matter if someone's trying to cross his face, someone's trying to work his edge. He does such a nice job of not panicking, being in position so he understands the biomechanics. This is something Joe Thomas talks about a ton, is the biomechanics and understanding how to let your body work for you. Because Joe Thomas is another guy that didn't have super long arms, but he had such a keen understanding of his body and how he could counteract whatever rushers are going to throw at him. And so I think Skoronski has some of that, where he understands, how to sink his weight, or just the different depth points with his footwork, things like that. So his understanding of that at such a young age is something that makes him, in my opinion, the best offensive lineman in this draft.
If you go listen to part 2 that we did with Mitchell and Marshall Newhouse, a lot of it, and a lot of the reason guys fail and succeed, is they tap into that idea of, do they know how to make their bodies work for them? And there's a certain confidence and calmness, I think, that comes with that. When you watch Skoronski, Brandon, he is just, the heart rate never changes. Like, that guy's just in complete control all the time, even when you compare him to other elite offensive line prospects. And that's what jumped out to me, at least.
Yeah, that's well said. That heart rate thing is a really good analogy that I think plays, out when you watch his film. I mean, he definitely has the feet, of a left tackle. To me, it's just the body type, is just such an outlier. That's really the only thing that would hold him back. from sticking at left tackle. It's funny you mentioned Joe Thomas. I think that's his favorite player, the guy that he studied the most as well. And yeah, I mean, he, I don't think he's as good of an athlete or quite as big as Joe Thomas, but there are some similarities there for sure. And he's hands down the best offensive lineman in the class, in my opinion, as well. It's just where he's going to play is, up for debate. And I think a lot of that is going to depend on where he goes. You mentioned the Bears and the Titans. I think those two spots are good places for him to play tackle, just because those offensive lines are in such dire need of the position. But there's other spots that he may go where, man, you put him at guard with, a young tackle, and, you could have who I compared him to. I really see the most likely outcome for him is like a Joe Tooney, which, that's a great, if that's, kind of disappointing for somebody, then that's a great kind of a floor, I guess, to have for somebody. And I think that's kind of what you're looking at with Skoronski.
There are no size concerns about Paris Johnson. You look at Paris Johnson, and maybe it's the 77, but the length and just his body type, just like there was like Tyron Smith aesthetics to what he looks like on the field. He's not the same sort of prospect, but like that was the first place my mind went because his arms are so long. So how would you compare him to some of the other elite guys that have come into the draft over the last maybe 3 or 4 years, Brandon? Like, where do you think he stacks up to some of the other high-end tackle prospects that we've been looking at recently?
Yeah, I would have him below most of them. Just going back to the last, so 2 years prior to this one is when I really started to do every offensive lineman in the draft. I looked at the class before that, which I think was like Andrew Thomas, Jedrick Wills, those guys, but really Penei Sewell, Slater, Darisaw, that was the class that I really kind of dug into everybody. And then since then, so just going off of those last couple of years, he'd probably be, he'd be below, Kwanu, Neal, Sewell, Slater, right there kind of with Darisaw to me is a similar kind of grade, very different players, but on our scale, it's more of like a middle of the first round grade, which, when it comes to the NFL draft, that's going to be a high first round grade, most likely, just because there's not a lot of tackles to choose from. I think when you look at Paris Johnson, like you mentioned, ideal measurables, height, weight, length, the movement skills to match as well. Competitive toughness with him, I think, is very impressive as well. For a guy who's so smooth and silky in his movements, he's actually, really physical and a good finisher. He's sticky as a run blocker. I think that's the best way to describe him. Once he's latched on a guy, he does a really good job of sustaining blocks and steering guys, finishing. So he brings that element as well. His biggest concern, and the reason why I have him knocked down a couple pegs here, is because, play strength, specifically in his anchor. And I think part of that is also strike timing, letting guys get inside of him, a little too quickly. And, Lucas Van Ness had a couple reps on him when they played, where he was able to just kind of blow him up in his, in his anchor. And a couple other guys were able to get inside of him and lift him up. And, so that's kind of the one knock on him, I think, that you're looking at. But I think if he cleans up his hands a little bit, maybe gets a little bit stronger. He's very young. All these guys that we're going to talk about are pretty young, 21 years old. He could certainly mature physically and get there. I compared him to, he's the left tackle Brian O'Neill. That's when I look at Brian O'Neill, and if I were to write a scouting report on him, which I actually did when he came out of Pittsburgh, very similar type of player. I think I like Paris a little bit more, but Brian O'Neill to me had a lot of the same strengths and the exact same kind of weaknesses. And I think that's the level of player you're probably going to get at left tackle with Paris Johnson, which is probably going to be an above average starter. That's probably, I think his most likely outcome.
With Paris Johnson, do you agree about that tiering, Dane? Do you feel like he's kind of a step down from some of those other guys and closer to the Darisaw range of things?
I do. I mean, this is not a super strong draft at the top. And he still didn't make my top 10. He's my 12th overall prospect in this draft. So as much as I do like Paris Johnson, I think he's the top tackle this year. I agree with a lot of what Brandon said. I don't think he's necessarily a blue chipper, a guy that's truly one of the best players in this draft. I think he's right now as a rookie can be a solid starter. And then, his trajectory moving forward, he can be, he can eventually compete for Pro Bowls down the road. But I think that he has enough there that you feel good about the guy you're getting. But I don't necessarily see someone with special to him. I see a guy with some very good traits and a lot of things to work with. I think that I agree with what Brandon said about just need to show better trust in the technique with his hands. And he's only had 1 year at left tackle. Like I said before, he was a guard as a sophomore, moved back to left tackle this past year. And I don't know how much he was truly tested week in, week out. I think he played very well, but against some of the better competition, like they're on the Georgia tape, there were a couple times where Georgia is able to get him a little bit off balance and get his weight drifting a little bit. And, I still think that NFL competition is going to be a little bit of a learning curve for him to catch up and, be a little more consistent at the top of his rush, be a little more consistent with his strike timing and placement. So Johnson's a good player. He's going to be a left tackle in this league, but I wouldn't call him a top 10 type of prospect.
Next question. We're going to do the same range of the draft, but we're going to flip it to right tackle. You need a starting right tackle, and every offensive lineman is on the board. I asked this question for two reasons. One, there's a player in the draft who found himself at right tackle, and maybe he becomes part of this conversation if it's specified to that position. And two, there's a certain team drafting 9th overall that, as things currently stand, desperately need a right tackle, and I am heavily invested in their success. So I'm curious, Dane, does that answer change for you if it's right tackle instead of left?
Honestly, I'm going to put this on Brandon because Brandon was the guy. I mean, Brandon and I, we text almost every day during, the season and during the draft prep as we kind of talk about these guys. And Darnell Wright from Tennessee has been one of his favorite players from the get-go. Just raving about Darnell Wright. So I want to hear what Brandon has to say about the Tennessee right tackle.
Yeah, my choice would be Darnell Wright. And that's because he's exclusively, in my opinion, a right tackle, whereas Paris Johnson, Georgia left tackle, Broderick Jones, even Peter Skoronski could, potentially move to the right, but we just haven't seen it. Darnell Wright, we have seen him play left and we have seen him play right, and he's just a different player on the right. And
why do you think that is?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that's a case-by-case basis. Sometimes it's just kind of a body mechanics thing, where guys just feel more comfortable on that side. When I talked to Darnell, he said he sees himself as a left tackle, which I thought was interesting because when you look at, I didn't look at a lot of 2021 of Darnell Wright, but I peeked at it. And then you look at, a lot of the 2022 Darnell Wright at right tackle, they're just different players. Maybe that's just, part of just an overall general kind of maturity thing as a player, maybe as a person, things like that. And it just clicked for him on the right. And maybe it could click for him on the left, now that he's at this level, that's, a potential outcome as well. But, when you just look at the film from the last 2 seasons, he just looks more comfortable on the right. And yeah, it's a very good question as to why. I just think, body mechanics is probably part of it, just feeling more comfortable, technique, and then also him just maturing, in that way. But yeah, I would go with Darnell Wright. I mean, to me, he's the most powerful offensive lineman in the class, and I'm kind of a sucker for that at the offensive line position. It's funny, when I first became exposed to Darnell Wright, prior to that, I saw a picture at Offensive Line Masterminds. I think I shared this with Dane, and he was there with a contingent of Tennessee guys, one of them being Trey Smith. And Darnell Wright is just, I don't want to say towering over Trey Smith, but he's clearly the bigger person. And I was just like, holy crap, like Trey Smith is a giant dude. I mean, so
just destroying people, destroying people week in and week out in the NFL. At times, Darnell Wright towers over him.
Yeah, I mean, he's bigger than him. Like he's just more broad, and I was just like, that caught my eye. And then I watched him on film and I was like, okay, you see the power that you would expect from him. He's heavy-handed. He can create instant movement at the point of attack. But the thing that really sold me on him was typically when you see these bigger hulking kind of guys, when guys get under and inside of them, they can really fall off the block quickly, lose control of the block. But his contact balance and his ability to sink and brace, and kind of absorb and take on force in his anchor was really what sold me on him. So he can actually recover much better than you would think for somebody his size. And that to me was really what kind of like sealed the deal and, why I gave him like a late first round grade. And that's where I have him. I see him as a right tackle. I think if you get him in like a play action heavy, kind of aggressive downhill scheme at right tackle, I mean, he could be really good right away. So yeah, I would pick Darnell Wright here.
Dane, you described him in the first sentence of your strengths portion from The Beast, said he has a thick torso and functional mass. And when I first started watching him, my first thought was, God, that's a thick man. He's just he's not as slender as, like, you look at Paris Johnson and then you look at Darnell Wright, and their body types are very different. And thick torso is probably how I would describe it. And one of the other notes, Dane, from The Beast, I thought was particularly interesting, because when you look at that body type, you said that some teams have him as a day one starting guard. And that is actually kind of intriguing based on the body type that he has and the skill set that he has to me.
Right. And I think it's because he does kind of have the look of a guard. It's not necessarily he can't play tackle. It's just, okay, would he be even better inside where he can really unleash that play strength and the power that Brandon was talking about. So it's a really interesting when you have a guy that wasn't really on the radar coming in. He was a former 5-star guy, so we knew who he was. But in terms of being a true prospect, wasn't really on the radar coming into the year as even a draftable guy, because his left tackle tape in 2021 was so bad. But then this year, he quickly turned that around. And as soon as he's going to be drafted, first thing they're going to do is show the Alabama tape from this past year going up against Will Anderson.
So when I
shut
watched
it down. Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
It just shut him down completely. And Darnell didn't give up a sack the entire season. So, I mean, he was fantastic from start to finish. I think when he gets his hands on people and he can latch, drive, displace, it's pretty much over. So, yeah, I think the bigger question with Darnell is what's his draft range? Where do you feel comfortable drafting a player like this? Because okay, like Brandon, say if your team is drafting 17th and you need a right tackle, are you considering Darnell there, or is that maybe a little bit earlier than you would feel comfortable taking him?
Yeah, I would really want to know what my offensive line room looked like, what my coaching staff looked like, and just kind of more of the details there, because that is a little high for me. I have a late first round grade on him. So that would be kind of on that, that cutoff where I potentially, if he's like the missing piece, for my offensive line, and I, just need a right tackle, and I have, kind of a play action oriented, multiple, at least kind of run scheme, then yeah, I probably would, seriously consider it. But ideally you get him, closer to the back half of round one. And, a couple more things about him. You mentioned the Alabama tape, but he also just played the best he played the best against the best competition, not only Alabama, but Georgia, LSU, Clemson, I thought were all good tapes as well, against good competition. So that's another feather in his cap. And just to kind of wrap it up with why I have him as a late first round grade, his testing actually surprised me a little bit. I didn't see as kind of a fluid of a mover, as, he may have tested as. I think his foot quickness is more average. And you see that, on an island, he kind of can create a short corner for himself against certain rushers. Will Anderson is more of a, speed to power, I'm going to try to run through the middle of you kind of guy. And that just fit perfectly with Darnell Wright, because Darnell was like, bring it. He knew going in that he matched up very well with Will Anderson. But then you look at a guy like Ojulari, and there's a couple other films as well, a little bit more of a bendy kind of guy who can access the corner. Those kind of guys, I think, are going to give him a little bit of trouble in the NFL. That's why I think kind of scheme and things like that are a little bit more important for him. But yeah, that's kind of the one little concern that I have for him.
And the other thing with Wright too is he's a fourth-year senior, but he's still just 21. He doesn't turn 22 until August, so he's one of the younger seniors in this entire class.
Dan, you also mentioned there's some balance issues with him sometimes. He get over aggressive, a little bit top heavy. So beyond some of the quickness and explosiveness concerns, there are some technique things to be worried about as well, that how that might translate to tackle full-time in the NFL.
Right. And I think that's where maybe some of he might be better at guard, where he doesn't have to cover as much space and doesn't have to worry about, drift or anything like that. He pretty much knows what's coming, and he can just, unleash that strength that he has. And I thought it was interesting. Like he didn't do the 3-cone at the combine or pro day. I was also interested he didn't do the bench press either, which I thought that's maybe where he would have shined. But not doing the 3-cone, that usually when an offensive lineman or anybody chooses not to do the 3-cone, it's because the testing numbers they were putting up during training just were not where you wanted them to be, and so that was notable.
The
Paris
bench
Johnson
press
also didn't test.
Yeah.
What do you think about that, Dane? Or would you be worried not having any of those numbers on him if you were going to draft him in the top 10? Again, I asked for very specific reasons. Yes.
Yeah. It's weird. I don't know if it's like, I know like agents sit down with these guys and say, okay, like, if you test, you hit all your peak numbers, you'll be middle of the road with, what teams look for at tackle. But if maybe you're even a little bit behind, then that's where questions might pop up. So let's not even give them questions to talk about. We just won't do it. Like it is a concern. There's no question. And I mean, there's a couple of offensive linemen in this draft who chose not to do specific drills or drills at all that I think are a little bit of a red flag. And so Paris Johnson, during his pro day, he did the positional drills, looked good doing them, but why not give us the vert or any of he did the broad jump. That's it. Broad jump at the bench at the combine, and then didn't do anything at his pro day. So I mean, Brandon, what's your take on that? It would worry me a little bit, not enough to where I'm going to say I'm not going to draft him, but enough that we're going to have an extra conversation with my coaches and my area scouts and try to just come to make sure we're all comfortable with the type of player he is.
Yeah, I think with Paris, once he did that bench, I mean, that was very impressive with 36+ inch arms.
Yeah.
That created a little bit of buzz for him, I think, and they probably just felt content, his camp at that point to not prove, feel the need to prove himself in the agilities. And I think when you look on the film too, I think you can feel pretty comfortable that he has the lateral quickness and the redirect skills, I think, are there. That one to me isn't too difficult to nail down on the film, but ideally you want to see him. And with Darnell, he told me that his bench wouldn't be very good when I did that film room with him. And it was, it's kind of surprising, but there are some guys, man, who just play extremely powerful, who, the majority of their power comes from, things like their hips, and maybe their hands that don't translate to the bench. The bench isn't necessarily the greatest indicator of play strength, although it is nice to have as well. So that one isn't too surprising to me. I would have liked to seen the agilities for Darnell, though. That one, because that one is the one that is a little bit questionable on film to me.
Where do you guys think, Brandon, Broderick Jones sits from Georgia compared to some of these other guys? What is the gap between those two that you mentioned at left tackle and somebody like Broderick Jones? Because he's the only one kind of at the top of the draft that we didn't really hit in this stretch.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier, there's a cluster of guys, and to me it's Paris 1, Broderick Jones 2, and Darnell Wright 3. And they're very tightly, clustered, like I said. So, but yeah, Broderick Jones to me is the most raw technically of these three, but you could argue he's the most talented in terms of just pure physical tools and traits. He checks the boxes, height, weight, length for sure. Man, he's a very, very good blocker on the move in space. He looks the part, on, those pull, leading and wrapping plays, kicking out the forced corner and, chasing down the third level safety and all that kind of stuff. He can do that at a high level. He has a lot of natural power, very physical. He checks the boxes physically in every way that you could want. It's just, when you watch him, especially earlier in the season, he just had some glaring, losses where his technique falls apart. Misses with his hands, lets guys let rushers get under and inside of him, drive him back, pry him open. It just kind of falls apart for him a little bit more than these other guys. But then you watch him, throughout the season, he got better and better and better. And it's like, okay, if he continues on this trajectory, he's also 21 years old. I would not be surprised at all if he's the best tackle from this class in 3-4 years. I think, if he's the first offensive lineman drafted, I wouldn't be too surprised, or concerned, honestly. So yeah, he's right there with these guys. I think it's just a pick your flavor kind of thing.
Dane, I'm pretty sure that Paris Johnson's the 12th ranked player on your board and Broderick Jones is 15. So there's not that big of a gap between them for you.
No, and I remember tweeting this out during the national championship game with Ohio State and Georgia, and tweeting out how, hey, this might be a battle of see who's going to be the first tackle drafted. Because I know there are some teams that have Broderick Jones OT1 on their board. They're believing in the talent, and he's played the fewest number of snaps among all these guys we're going to be talking about. Basically a 1-year starter, full-time starter. He started 4 games in 2021, but didn't really become the full-time guy until this year. And so you could see him learning on the fly. There are times you throw on the Missouri tape and watch him against Isaiah McGuire, who is a borderline top 100 pick in this draft. And you see him, McGuire, just be able to bully him backwards, put him on his heels, into the pocket, into the quarterback when his hands weren't right. But then you see the next play and you see these movement skills where he's getting out in space and doing some things that, most left tackles just can't do. So he has the foot quickness. It's that basketball background that he has. In the offseason, he said he would get down to about 275 and just really lean, really svelte. And then bulk back up when it's time for the football season and get back up to 310, where his normal playing weight is. And he would do that comfortably because he has this body type and he has the athletic tools to do it. So not a big surprise to see him test the way that he did. He came in actually bigger and longer than we expected. He was listed at, I think, 6'4". At Georgia, comes in over almost 6'5.5".
The first time that's ever happened.
Never happened before, right? And I mean, the length I had on him from the preseason was 33 and a half. And then he comes in 34 3/4. It's like, okay, wait a minute. He's super long too. And just 21 years old, still learning, still figuring things out. Yeah, I can understand why a team is going to bet on the talent and say, okay, we can coach this guy up. We're not drafting him for who he is right now. We're drafting him for, 2-3 years from now and what this guy's going to look like.
I'm looking at his mock draftable page right now, and I enjoy mock draftable. You guys haven't used before. They like spider charts for measurables, and they have player comparisons on the left side. So guys that have similar athletic profiles. Braxton Jones from last year, his number one comp physically is Broderick Jones.
Yeah, put him on the right side.
There so if you're curious, the Bears might have a type in terms of measurables at that position.